Chris Brown's music career has spanned for nearly 20 years, but not without its fair share of controversy and legal troubles. The singer's many legal issues were revisited in a new documentary from the producers of Quiet on Set. Chris Brown, A History of Violence, which premiered on Investigation Discovery this week, looked into Brown's legal troubles and the seeming pattern of violence that has plagued his career. Chris Brown first came onto the music scene in 2005 when he was just 16 years old. As many boasted, he was the new Michael Jackson. But just 4 years later, his legal troubles began when LAPD responded to a 911 call. The caller said a woman was assaulted on a Hollywood street just after midnight on February 8th. When police arrived, that's where they found the woman with a battered face. That woman was Brown's then-girlfriend, 20-year-old Rihanna. According to police, Rihanna was assaulted during an argument that began when she read text messages from another woman on her then-boyfriend's phone the morning before they were set to perform on the Grammy Awards. Detectives say Brown became enraged and forced her out of the car, hit her head against the passenger window, punched her in the eye, and drove away while steering with one hand and continuing to punch her with the other. As blood filled Rihanna's mouth, Brown allegedly told her, "I'm going to beat the out of you when we get home. You wait and see." Rihanna then reportedly faked a phone call to her assistant saying, "I'm on the way home. Make sure the cops are there when I get there." And Brown reportedly responded, "You just did the stupidest thing ever. Now I'm really going to kill you." Chris Brown avoided jail time in the case, instead was sentenced to 5 years of probation and 180 days of community labor. At the time, his attorney Mark Garrigo said in a statement, quote, "This is a kid who's never been in trouble before, who wants to move past this and make sure that the message gets out that these kinds of things of domestic violence are not acceptable, and that he has accepted responsibility and continues to do so, and embraced this as an opportunity for him to get his life back on track and his career back on track." Then 2 years after the assault, Chris Brown reportedly stormed off the set of ABC's Good Morning America after Robin Roberts asked him about the domestic abuse incident. After Roberts asked him about this situation 2 more times, according to ABC, Brown seemed increasingly agitated. Then, after performing a song on his album Fame, he stormed off stage, went back to his dressing room, and smashed the window of his green room. 2 years after the GMA meltdown, Brown and his bodyguard were arrested after a physical altercation with 2 men outside the W Hotel. The singer spent 36 hours in jail and later pleaded guilty to misdemeanor assault, and he was sentenced to time served. In November of 2013, Brown entered rehab, but was kicked out 2 weeks after he violently lashed out during a family therapy session and smashed the window of his mother's car. A judge ordered Brown spend 90 days in a live-in rehab facility for anger management. But in March of 2014, he was kicked out of the court-ordered rehab program for violating the facility's rules and was then jailed for violating the terms of his probation for the Rihanna attack. Brown was sentenced to a year in jail, but he was granted early release the following month. In 2016, Las Vegas PD launched an investigation into Brown after a woman alleged he stole her phone and punched her in the face after she tried to take a photo of him during a party. Brown's accuser, Liziani Gutierrez, was interviewed for the documentary and admitted she shouldn't have taken the unwanted photo, but said it didn't give Brown the right to punch her in the face. She said after the incident, she filed a report with Las Vegas PD, but Brown, in a deleted Instagram video, denied involvement and said his accuser was probably too ugly to get into the party. His reps released a statement calling Gutierrez's claims unequivocally untrue, saying this seems like a clear case of retaliation of her bruised ego. Months later, in June of 2016, he was sued by his manager for assault and battery. Chris Brown hired Mike Gergeis, also known as Mike G, to help rebrand his image after the 2009 assault. But Mike G alleged he was attacked by Brown, who allegedly shut him in a room and punched him in the face and neck. The two settled out of court in 2019. 2 months after Brown was sued in 2016, he was arrested on suspicion of assault with a deadly weapon following a 9-hour police standoff. That incident stemmed from a woman who alleged the singer threatened her with a gun. After the woman left his home, Brown and his entourage reportedly refused to return her phone unless she signed an NDA. The woman reportedly was able to get her phone. Then she fled to a neighbor's house and hid under a car. When police were outside of Brown's home, he made videos on social media criticizing police for always coming after him, saying in part, quote, "When I call the police for a stalker, people that are endangering my life, they don't come until the next day." Police eventually arrested him for assault with a deadly weapon, but the charges were never filed. Over those several years, Chris Brown and Karrueche Tran had an on and off again relationship, which ended in 2014. But 3 years later, in 2017, a judge granted Tran a 5-year restraining order against Brown after Tran testified her ex boyfriend became aggressive after he demanded she return diamond rings he had gifted her. The then 29-year-old said in court Brown texted her violent threats like, "I can get my money back and I'm tired of playing games. I will beat the out of you. And I promise you I will make your life hell." She also testified Brown threatened to kill her and alleged he punched her in the stomach twice and pushed her down the stairs. No police report was filed at that time, but according to People magazine, the alleged incidents would have occurred when he was still on probation for assaulting Rihanna. In 2018, he and two of his friends were sued for sexual battery and assault. The trio allegedly held the victim down against her will and took her phone and wouldn't return it. Brown's lawyer, Mark Garagos, called the allegations a shakedown. The suit was dismissed in 2020 after Brown settled out of court. And in the documentary, another bombshell when one of Brown's accusers comes forward alleging she was raped by the singer on now embattled music mogul Sean Diddy Combs' yacht in 2020. The woman who appeared in a silhouette in the documentary and went by Jane Doe claimed while on a trip to Miami, a mutual acquaintance invited her to a party on Diddy's boat. Doe said at the time she had recently moved to LA and was pursuing dancing when she saw Brown at the party and hoped it was a sign he would guide her or give her some advice. She said the two talked and he handed her a drink, but said that's when her memory got weird. Doe said she didn't remember if she saw the singer pour the drink, but she just drank it and he gave her another drink. And then she began to feel tired and her body started feeling heavy. She claimed Brown took her to one of the yacht's bedrooms and raped her. She says after the incident, she admitted she continued to speak to Brown. And while at first she says she didn't recognize the incident as a sexual assault, she went to therapy where she could admit to herself that it was a rape. In 2022, she filed a $20 million lawsuit against Brown. However, the suit was dismissed after a judge cited a lack of prosecution. But for Chris Brown, his career in recent years hasn't wavered, and he continues to get support from his Hollywood counterparts and his dedicated fan base. Let's bring on attorney and former prosecutor Melba Pearson to get her take on the Chris Brown documentary. Melba, always so great to see you. To be honest, this documentary didn't really come as a shock to me. We've all seen these allegations in the news, but Chris Brown still has a huge fan base and his career is still ongoing. Other celebrities, also rally support for him. Why do you think that is, given his history of violence toward women and even men?
That's Elizabeth, that's a really good question, and I don't have a solid answer for that. I can only guess that because he exploded on the scene so young and he just, had this great star quality about him. He was so talented. Many people refer to him as almost like another Michael Jackson in terms of his level of talent. So I think there's a lot of folks who feel that if they could rally around him and give him the support he needs, that maybe he can overcome these issues and not continually be violent in the way he reacts to people. There has been some discussion about childhood trauma, that was sort of the genesis of his violent outburst now that we're seeing as an adult, and clearly it hadn't been addressed. But I think at some point you have to realize that this situation is not getting better. And if he didn't curb his violence in the aftermath of his very public um, violence that he perpetrated against Rihanna and the court proceedings that followed. And then, of course, we find out that Karrueche Tran, his, one of the next high-profile girlfriend he had, also filed a restraining order against him for the length of 5 years. At some point, we have to realize that he's not getting better, and now it needs to be about tough love. And it's, listen, hey, I support you as an artist, etc. But until you get help, you're not going to appear in my video. Until you get help, I'm not going to bring you on stage in my concert. That sort of thing. I just think that the celebrity community needs to be much more forceful in the way that they're dealing with Chris Brown and not giving him a pass.
And going back to 2009, why do you think Chris Brown didn't serve jail time for assaulting Rihanna?
Part of it is I think that it was his first offense. To the best of my knowledge, he didn't have any prior convictions. So in a first time incident such as that, there was no, not, and I'm not in any way, shape, or form trying to downplay what happened to Rihanna, but it was more bruising as opposed to broken bones or the use of a weapon. Unlike what we saw in the case of Megan the Stallion, where she was actually shot, that is a different level of felony as opposed to the battery that he perpetrated on Rihanna. So, and also, I don't know that Rihanna necessarily wanted him to go to jail, which is another important component when a prosecutor is looking at these types of cases. You also take into consideration what the survivor wants. What does the survivor consider to be justice in this instant? And if it's just a matter of, I want this person away from me, then you see a plea resolution like what we saw, where he was going to have to go to counseling, he was on probation, he had to stay away from her, etc. So that sentence is not abnormal for the level of charge and the level of injury that we saw in the case between Chris Brown and Rihanna.
And I think an interesting point also in the documentary was just that I think sometimes when we discuss their relationship in totality as well as the assault, that a lot of people kind of do forget just the imagery of the assault and the brutality of it as well too. And I do kind of want to applaud Investigation Discovery for not showing those photos of Rihanna bruised when they were playing the documentary. But it was interesting because I know you and I have had a lot of discussions about like why domestic violence survivors do get back with their partners and their perpetrators after this type of thing happens. But what are your thoughts on just kind of maybe in the minds of a lot of his fans and a lot of maybe potentially other celebrities, people kind of forget just the brutality behind the assault, given that the two did get back together afterwards?
Right, and a lot of people don't understand the cycle of violence and the battered person syndrome, where basically on average, it will take someone 5 to 7 times before they leave their abuser. It's not as simple as, okay, you hit me, that's it, that's the end of the relationship. In some cases, that does happen, but many times, because remember, at the end of the day, nobody gets hit on the first date because there wouldn't be a second date. So you've experienced this person who was kind and loving and you had a great time with, you had a great rapport, and then suddenly there's this escalation of violence. So there's this confusion because you know this side of the person who you've fallen in love with and is a kind, good person. But then there's sort of like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, there's an evil side, and it's very hard to reconcile the two. So, and on top of that, if you had childhood trauma or you were a child that witnessed domestic violence growing up, children that witness domestic violence are highly likely to either end up as survivors of domestic violence later on or to be perpetrators of violence on others as a result if they're not able to unpack the trauma that they went through. So there's all sorts of issues at play that may cause a person to go back to their abuser, and that's notwithstanding the financial aspect, if you have children together, all of those other practical aspects that you have to deal with. So I think that again, because of the length of time that this happened, I mean, now we're looking, close to 15 years ago when this happened. So a lot of it has left the public eye. You see Rihanna move on to have this beautiful relationship and family. So it's sort of like, well, she's doing well. Nobody's really focused on that, her past, so to speak. She's not bringing it up, and rightfully so. And then Karrueche Tran, again, she was not overly vocal about what she went through in the press, and there didn't seem to be that level of photographic evidence like we saw in terms of the Rihanna case to again drive home that this was an extremely violent interaction. And then, of course, we heard about these one-offs where he punches this a man as a result of a dispute. He punches another woman because she tried to take a picture with her phone. So there's all of these horrible incidents that have compounded one on top of the other. And it still boggles my mind why people still support him. Listen, at the end, he is a very talented artist. He's a wonderful, he has a great voice, he's a great dancer, but that doesn't mean he's a good person.
Yeah. And, when we have these discussions, I think a lot of times when we're covering these cases where domestic violence goes very far to the point that a partner kills their other partner. But in this case, thankfully, Rihanna did survive this incident. But when it comes to this discussion surrounding their relationship, I think a lot of people like to downplay it by saying they were in a toxic relationship or he was so young when this had happened. What are your thoughts on those arguments? Given that they were 19 and 20 years old when this had happened. But at the same time, would we be giving this excuse if it wasn't someone who is a Chris Brown?
We absolutely would not be giving that excuse. The reality is, if this was our next door neighbor, if this was somebody at work, we'd be like, oh my gosh, what can we do ideally? What can we do to get the survivor support? Often also we see people not wanting to get involved, like that's their business. Whatever goes on behind closed doors, that's between the two of them. I don't want to intervene because if she goes and gets back together with him again, now everybody's going to hate me because I got involved in the situation. So I think there's a lot of misconceptions around how people should act and react in these types of situations. But and yes, they were young when this happened, but that does not detract from the amount of violence that he used against her. It does not detract from the fact that this was a domestic violence relationship. Yes, toxicity may be a part of many relationships. Unfortunately, that's the reality. But toxicity does not always mean a violent relationship. Toxicity doesn't always mean that now you're going to get punched or you're going to get slapped or worse, weapons being used against you. So I think a lot of people were really twisting themselves sideways in a way to justify or to kind of again support Chris Brown because of his age, because of his celebrity, and because of his talent. But we have to get away from giving these people a pass. The reality is, yes, people make mistakes. If this was a situation where it was an isolated incident where he harmed Rihanna. He did make that public apology, but then we didn't have any incidences after that. We would be in a very different story because now that's a matter of he made a mistake, he learned from it, he worked on his issues, and he was able to move forward. But when we keep seeing this recurring uh, violent behavior with different people, with women, with men, people getting restraining orders against him, he clearly has a very serious problem.
Yeah, and you've mentioned a lot of other instances that were also alluded to in the documentary, going on to date Karuchi Tran after they broke up, accused of stalking her. Then a judge granted a restraining order against him. And another woman alleges Brown stole her phone after she took a video of him during a party. He's accused of smashing the window of his green room during an appearance at GMA. He fought Frank Ocean. He was sued for sexual assault. We see these patterns often, or not even often, I should say. We see these patterns throughout the years following 2009. But, as you just mentioned, is there a point where Hollywood does say enough is enough? Because, even at times when Chris Brown may appear to be canceled, that doesn't really happen. And what I have noticed as well too is, a lot of people in the Black community as well too rally around and support him. I get, and I understand maybe the history of why that happens, but at the same time, it's just when you see this constantly throughout the years of and things don't appear to be getting better, I should say. What does that say to you as far as just everything that we're seeing in totality? And what does that say to people who have been alleged victims of Chris Brown?
It sends a horrible message to those who have survived Chris Brown and have survived sexual violence and intimate partner violence, gender based violence. It's basically saying that you don't matter. And that's unacceptable. We have to hold abusers accountable, period, end of story. That accountability can be different based on the totality of the circumstances, the severity of what happened, but you have to be held accountable for your actions. And we saw the same pattern when it came to R. Kelly. Nobody wanted to believe these girls, and some in the Black community were so quick to say, well, these girls are fast, these girls are loose, they knew what they were coming here for. Meanwhile, they're 14 years old. You're a child. You don't know what you're going into. You don't understand the ramifications of what you're getting into, right? So there's that lack of protection of our youth and of our women, and again, that's unacceptable. That's what I would call toxic masculinity, and really just buying into this patriarchal system where men are allowed to abuse others with impunity and without any real consequence. And that's not doing a service to the Black community, to women, to anyone. And so we have to be realistic about who our heroes are. You may idolize somebody because of their music, but again, that doesn't mean they're a good person. And we have to be able to separate the artist from the art.
Yeah, and one of Chris Brown's accusers was interviewed for the documentary. However, she appeared in a silhouette. Her voice was disguised, and like in her lawsuit, she went by the name of Jane Doe. But she alleges Chris Brown raped her on Diddy's yacht in 2020. But she even said after the assault, she continued to text and message with him. What do you make of the allegations of rape on Diddy's yacht, as well as just kind of even in the aftermath? I think she, being Jane Doe, kind of didn't recognize that what had happened to her allegedly was a rape, but she did say that, plainly and flat outly during the documentary, she was raped by Chris Brown, again, allegedly. But what do you make of just that whole case? In addition to, I think a lot of people may not believe her necessarily because she continued to message Brown even after the fact.
So there's a few things to unpack here. First off, to me, this seems very on brand because if you're in that circle, you're friends with Diddy, you're going to those parties, you've already established that you do not have respect for women, as evidenced by the fact that you beat women, basically any woman you've had a relationship with, you seem to have committed some sort of violence against them. So it is not a stretch for me to believe that he sexually assaulted, this woman. Now, the fact that she ended up messaging with him afterwards is not abnormal. And the reason why is because she was in denial as to what happened to her. Nobody wants to claim the banner or the mantle of being a sexual assault survivor. Nobody wants it, but it ends up being your reality. So she was in a place where, first of all, she was drugged. So she's trying to piece together what had happened. She remembers hanging out with Chris Brown initially, being very excited to talk to him about her future. She then remembers drinking something and feeling heavy. She then remembers being in a bedroom and then being assaulted. And so she's taking these bits and pieces of the memories and trying to make sense of it. And also, she's probably hoping in messaging back and forth with him, either A, she can get more clarity on what happened, or B, somehow maybe she'll get an apology. Maybe she could somehow make herself feel better and come to terms with what had happened to her. And it took time, but eventually she was able to fully grasp that, yes, she was sexually assaulted and what happened to her was wrong. Now, the statute of limitations has not expired. However, it seems that she tried to go the criminal justice route, and the prosecutor declined to file charges. Again, number of reasons for that. She may not have been forthright with her with discussing the fact that she had been in contact with him, because again, maybe she was embarrassed. There's a whole number of things. But again, you have to remember, being sexually assaulted destroys any type of comfort that you may have. It completely shifts your worldview, and people can assume or say, well, if it happened to me, I would act this way. You don't know how you would act until, God forbid, it happens to you. And a lot of things you may do in that time, in that place, may not make sense. The only way you could be a sexual assault survivor is if you were assaulted in a dark alley by somebody you didn't know. You basically were wearing a nun's habit, and you weren't wearing a short skirt, you weren't at a party, you didn't drink anything, for the entire week, and that you have to be rocking back and forth with a sheet over you, and then, okay, that is what a sexual assault survivor should look like. That's not the reality. The reality is You could be a sex worker and be sexually assaulted. You could have, gone to a fraternity or a sorority party on campus and passed out and somebody sexually assaulted you. That doesn't mean you deserved it. It doesn't mean it was right. It's still illegal. So I think we have to shift that mindset around consent and what the reactions are to sexual assault, and understand that people handle trauma differently. And not everybody follows the same playbook in how they deal with being violated.
And I think what we're kind of seeing in a way also is kind of this turning point within the discussions, as well as kind of recognizing that these things do happen within our community. I think first it, slowly started to begin with Bill Cosby, R. Kelly. Now we're kind of rolling into Diddy and a little bit of Chris Brown here as well too. At any point, do you think that people will recognize this is enough? We're tired of this. We're tired of seeing it. Do you think that'll actually happen within our community?
I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that with the increase of the availability of information, the fact that more and more survivors are telling their stories on social media and in ways that are very accessible to the public, that people will start to get a better understanding of the pain that this inflicts upon people. And again, that it looks differently for every person, that how they react to that trauma. Um, Again, I mean, I'm hopeful. I've got to keep hope, right? Because without that, we're lost. So I'm hopeful that this movement around Me Too and seeing R. Kelly and P. Diddy and Bill Cosby and Harvey Weinstein and all of these, Kevin Spacey, all of these high-powered, influential celebrities being held accountable for sexual assault will trickle down to our communities and to the average everyday person who ends up being a survivor of violence in some way, shape, or form, and empowers them to be able to use the legal system to hold their abuser accountable. But then also that we see an increase in resources in communities, not only just within the prosecutor's offices, but sometimes people go through these types of experiences and don't want to involve the criminal justice system for a number of reasons, but making sure that there's community resources that people can go get help. So even if they don't utilize the police and the prosecutor's office to be able to get justice, they're able to get closure by getting therapy, by making sure they're treated for any ailments that may have resulted from the violence that they suffered, and to be able to get their minds and their lives back together after something like this happens. So that is where my hope lies moving forward.
All right. Well, Melba Pearson, thank you so much for your insight into this. I always appreciate your time. Anything else you'd like to add before we sign you off?
Just remember that if you are someone who has survived either domestic violence, sexual assault, the, I believe you. There are people that believe you. So please get the help that you need. Don't suffer in silence.
All right. Melba Pearson, thank you again so much for your time today.
My pleasure.
The producers of the documentary reportedly reached out to Chris Brown and his representatives about the claims, and an attorney for the singer said the allegations in the program were malicious and false. Reporting for Law and Crime, I'm Elizabeth Millner.